but he was a very clever researcher. And what he did is he asked people to veto your decision. That is, that when you're about to flip the switch, say, no, I'm not going to do it. I've changed my mind. And the veto didn't have a spike in the brain. So he said, it's not so much that he showed there was free will, but they showed there was free won't. And he commented, he was a religious man, and he said, this is the traditional religious way of understanding human motivation, that we're hit with temptations from our brain, but we have the free choice to do it or not.
Is there any scientific evidence for the existence of the soul? Take a look at this great clip over here with American neurosurgeon Dr. Michael Egnor. And he goes through a lot of the scientific research and evidence that has been advanced over the years that points to the existence of a soul. And some of these experiments, some of these conclusions may really surprise you. So we'll watch this clip together and then we'll talk about it. But first, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Check this out.
I saw a number of things over my career that made me question the traditional materialist way of understanding how the brain works. The patients I'm going to show you here are real people. I've changed their names, but they're very real people. The picture on, I guess it would be which side? On your left is an MRI of the brain of a young lady, and the black there is spinal fluid. The brain is the gray stuff there. She's missing about 2/3 of her brain. That's the way she was born. The image alongside of it is a normal brain for comparison. When she was a young baby, we scanned her and found this, and we were rather pessimistic with her family about her chances of having a normal life. She grew up a completely normal person. She was on the honor roll in high school. If you met her today, you'd say, oh, she's a bright young lady. She's perfectly fine, missing 2/3 of her brain. This is a little boy named Joshua. He was born missing also about 2/3 of his brain. And he is that, again, that black space there is just water. He was evaluated by the ethics committee at my hospital, and they recommended that he not be fed when he was born because he was in such terrible shape that it'd be better if he passed away. We rescinded that order and fed him, and he's now graduating from high school, perfectly normal young man, plays sports, he's a great kid. Maggie is a young lady who was in a gifted program when she was young. She's a brilliant young woman, missing most of her cerebellum and part of the central regions of her brain. She has had to have some surgery to take care of fluid pressure there, but she's done very well. She has a master's degree in English literature, and she's a published musician. Nicholas is a little boy who's quite handicapped. He has cerebral palsy, and he's missing both hemispheres of his brain. The only part of his brain he has is his brainstem. He is handicapped. He can't speak. He can't walk, but he's fully conscious. He's kind of funny. He laughs. He cries. He's an emotionally a normal person, even though he is handicapped, even though he's missing his entire brain hemispheres. So it raises the question, it sounds like a really strange question, but as you see, it's not so strange. Is the brain the organ of the mind? You know, the heart's the organ of circulation, the kidneys are the organ of making urine, but is the brain completely the organ of the mind? Clearly, in some ways it is, but in other ways it may not be. This question was first addressed by Wilder Penfield, who's a neurosurgeon, worked in Montreal in the mid-20th century, probably the greatest scientist in the neurosurgical profession. And he was the pioneer in epilepsy surgery. And he would do awake brain surgery, meaning that patients during the brain surgery would be fully awake with local anesthesia, so they felt no pain. And he would stimulate their brain to map the surface of their brain to remove foci of epilepsy. And he asked a fascinating question. He said, why are there no intellectual seizures? When people have seizures, if they remain conscious during the seizures, they do one of four things. They'll have uncontrollable movements. Their arm will shake. They can have sensations like tingling on their skin. They can have emotions, powerful fear or laughter or joy. And they can have memories. You can have a seizure where you get this recurrent memory. But nobody ever has a calculus seizure. Nobody ever has a mathematics seizure where you can't stop doing long division. And And Penfield said, that's really odd. If you can evoke all these other things, why can't you evoke abstract thought, reasoning, theology, philosophy, thinking about God? It doesn't happen from seizures. And he said the most reasonable explanation is that that aspect of the mind isn't from the brain. He tested this further by intraoperatively with awake patients, stimulating the surface of their brain to map the brain, just like you would map a city, and to find out where different things were located on the brain, again, so he could protect them in removing epileptic foci. But he couldn't find any kind of abstract thought centers in the brain. There's a movement center, there's a sensation center, there's a visual center, there's a hearing center, there are emotional centers, there are memory centers. But there's no center for thinking abstractly. There's no center for reason. And he said, that's odd. That's the same thing that he found with looking at the kinds of seizures that happen. Some of the most interesting work along this line has been done by Roger Sperry and his colleagues. Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this work. Back in the mid-20th century, an operation was developed for people who would have a seizure in one hemisphere of the brain that would spread to the other hemisphere. And these were catastrophic seizures that were very difficult to control. So what Sperry, an operation that was developed, not by Sperry, but by others, was to cut the brain in half, essentially, so that if a seizure started in one half of the brain, it couldn't spread to the other half, and that made the seizures much easier to control and much milder. And it was called a corpus callosotomy, and we still do that surgery today. So the hemispheres of the brain are functionally disconnected. And Sperry, who was a neuroscientist, realized that you could study what each hemisphere does because they're disconnected. So he did a lot of wonderful work, and the left hemisphere controls speech, the right hemisphere controls spatial orientation, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. But one thing that he noticed, and I've noticed too, is that people who've had their brains cut in half are pretty normal people. As you meet these people, the brains are cut in half, and they're walking and talking, they feel normal. They have less seizures than they used to have. It would be the same thing as if someone just took a chainsaw and cut the laptop in half, and it still worked just fine. Like, there's something odd about this. The follow-up research on that is something that still gives me chills. And I learned about this decades ago, and I think it's among the most fascinating results in cognitive neuroscience. Justine Sergent was a researcher at McGill in Montreal, worked about 20 years after Sperry. And she studied people with split brain surgery. And what she did was she found a way to present pictures of things, like pictures of arrows, to each hemisphere separately at the same time. So she put arrows up that the right hemisphere would see one arrow, the left hemisphere would see the other arrow, but no part of the brain saw both arrows. One half saw one arrow, the other half saw the other arrow. And she asked the people, are the arrows pointing in the same direction or not? And they always got it right. But how could they compare arrows when no part of the brain saw both arrows? So she concluded that there was something in the mind that wasn't in the brain. Pinto has furthered that research in which he tells stories to split brain patients, where the first half of the story is presented to one hemisphere. The second half of the story is presented to the other hemisphere. But you don't understand the story unless you see both. A good example would be if the left hemisphere can see a baseball, and the right hemisphere can see a broken window. So Pinto would ask the patient, what happened? And the patients always answered, the baseball broke the window. But no part of the brain saw both the baseball and the window. So there's something in the mind that's not in the brain. Walter Penfield also studied free will, and he did a very interesting study. During these awake brain operations, he would stimulate the surface of a patient's brain, and if you stimulate the right place, you can make them do things, like make them raise their arm. He would ask them during the surgery to occasionally raise their arm themselves without him stimulating them. And you can't feel your brain. Your brain has no sensory things, and the patients are under surgical drapes, so they can't see what he's doing. And he would ask them, when your arm goes up, I want you to tell me whether you did it or whether I did it. And they always got it right. Hundreds of thousands of trials of this in 1,100 patients. No one ever missed it. No one ever got it wrong. And he concluded then that he couldn't find any place in the brain that simulated free will. That free will wasn't in the brain, that you could always tell, this is my will. This is not someone doing it to me. So free will is not a brain function. Benjamin Libet did probably the most famous research on free will. And what Libet found, and it would take a while to go into details about how he did his experiments, they were quite ingenious. But he would record electrical signals from the scalp, and these are people who haven't had any surgery, they're just normal volunteers. And what he found was that when you decide to do something simple, there tends to be a spike in brain activity that happens about a half second before you decide. Like if you're going to turn on a light switch, about a half second before you turn on the light switch, your brain spikes. And that's before you're aware that you're going to turn it on. So and that seems at first glance that everything is driven by your brain. Your brain makes you do it, and you don't really have any free will. It's all just chemicals driving you to do things. But he was a very clever researcher, and what he did is he asked people to veto your decision. That is, that when you're about to flip the switch, say, no, I'm not going to do it. I've changed my mind. And the veto didn't have a spike in the brain. So he said, it's not so much that he showed there was free will, but they showed there was free won't. That is that your brain, and he commented, he was a religious man, and he said, this is the traditional religious way of understanding human motivation, that we're hit with temptations from our brain, but we have the free choice to do it or not. Because the free choice to do it or not did not have any new brain activity at all. It was independent of the brain. So the brain keeps hitting you with these things, have that extra piece of cake. But you can say yes or no, and you can't blame your brain. Adrian Owen is a researcher, I think he's currently in Indiana, he was at Cambridge in England, did a fascinating study in patients in persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is the deepest level of coma. It's just a step above brain death. And it happens when people have had very severe brain injuries from lack of oxygen or from motor vehicle accidents. And it's called vegetative because it's been assumed that these people are basically vegetables, meaning that they have no mind. They're just a body and there's no mind left. Some of you may recall the Terry Schiavo stuff that went on about 20 years ago. She was in persistent vegetative state. What Owen did is he put patients in MRI machines and did functional MRI imaging that shows brain activity. And he would ask them to think about things with a headset. He'd say, think about walking across the room, or think about your family, or think about playing tennis. And they would show patterns of brain activation in their very damaged brain. And he then did that with normal volunteers and found the patterns were identical, implying that they were understanding what he was talking about. And then what he did, and he was very clever, he asked the same questions, but he mixed up the words so they didn't make any sense. Instead of think about walking across the room, he'd say room across walking about think. Doesn't make any sense. And the brain was silent. So these people were understanding the questions he was asking, even though their brains were practically destroyed. And he actually found, he and other people have replicated his work, that about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state show clear evidence of being able to communicate. There are people who can do mathematics in persistent vegetative state. You ask them, what's 9 plus 6? You count, when you hit 15, the brain lights up. There are people who can tell their family histories. You know, is your brother's name George? Brain will light up. So you can communicate with people in the deepest level of coma in many cases. Near-death experiences are sort of the paradigmatic example of a separation between the soul or the mind and the brain. And while some near-death experiences may be not genuine, they may be hallucinations or whatever, there's no doubt that there is a real core of real experiences. They're probably about 20% of near-death experiences are veridical, meaning they can be checked. The person knows things that occurred when they were dead, things that went on inside the room, etc. The probably most famous near-death experience was Pam Reynolds, who was an aneurysm patient, operated on in 1991. And in order to safely operate on the aneurysm, her surgeon had to stop her heart after cooling her body down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that gave him about 30 minutes to fix the aneurysm. He drained all the blood out of her brain, fixed the aneurysm, and then rewarmed her and started her heart again. And she survived and did very well, actually. She said, in the recovery room, she said, I watched the operation. He said, what? You were brain dead. You couldn't possibly watch the operation. So she said that as soon as her brain went dead, she popped out of her body, floated up to the ceiling, watched the surgery. She said that her vision was amazingly accurate, and it was a beautiful scene. And then she told him what he talked about during the surgery. She told him what the instruments looked like and what music was playing in the room during the surgery. And things like this have happened a number of times. So in my view, there's no question that some near-death experiences are very real. The other thing that for me is very convincing is that people have surveyed the literature, and there are thousands of examples of this in the literature, where people go down a tunnel and they see loved ones and relatives at the other end of the tunnel. Nobody in the medical literature who's had a near-death experience has ever seen a living person at the other end of the tunnel. It's not like you kind of want your mother and your mother's still alive and you see her at the other end of the tunnel. Only dead people are at the other end of the tunnel, including people that you didn't know were dead. There are a number of examples of people who were in car accidents where someone in the car died and they didn't know the person died because they were critically injured also, and they saw that person on the other side of the tunnel, but not people in the car who didn't die.
One of the things that I think about when I see videos like this is the verse in Job chapter 10 that says, "You've clothed me with skin and with flesh." In other words, you've clothed me with skin and with flesh. That the me is below the skin and the flesh. The skin and the flesh is the clothing. The me, the I, is below them, is the soul, is something deeper, the person, the mind living within the person. And there's different layers of consciousness, different layers of soul, but that the body is simply a garment. One of the thought experiments that I think about as well is if you imagine yourself in your mind's eye, looking at yourself in the mirror, but rather than your current self looking back at you, you think about your 15-year-old self. Well, you look very different now than you did when you were 15. Maybe when you were 15, you had braces and you had pimples, different hairstyle. And if you backtrack that another 5 years to your 10-year-old self, your 10-year-old self and your 15-year-old self both look different than your current self. Your 10-year-old self might have had glasses and crooked teeth. Your 15-year-old self had pimples and braces. And if you go back to your 5-year-old self, you have even a different little boy or little girl. And if you fast forward 20 years, you're also looking different. So which stage along the way is the real us? We're constantly physically changing. Which one is the real me? If you take that a step further and you understand that a lot of the cells in our body have died and replenished themselves. Every few years, many of the cells die and replenish themselves. So a lot of the cells that are in your body right now are different than the cells that were when you were 15 or when you were 5 years old, and will be different in 20 years' time from now as well. Which one is the real me? And then if you go a step deeper, besides for the physical aspects of the person, and you think about the emotions, the things that made you happy, sad, scared, excited now and when you were 15 are very different things. And likewise, your emotions, your things that made you happy, sad, scared, excited when you were 5 are also different than they were when you were 15, and also different now, and may also be different 20 years from now as well. Question is, which one is the real me? So physically, we're constantly changing. Emotionally, we're constantly changing. Intellectually as well, we think about things differently now than we did when we were 15, different when we were 5. At 5, we thought about it one way, at 15 another, right now another thing, and 20 years from now might think about things in a different way. Which one is the real me? In fact, if physically we're changing constantly, and emotionally we're changing constantly, and intellectually we're changing constantly, which one is the real me? How do I even know when I'm looking in the mirror that it's me looking back at me? And so the answer from a Jewish perspective or from a biblical perspective would be that place of permanence inside, that place that doesn't change, that me that lives inside of me, that is forever, despite all of the external changes, is what we call the soul. It's how I know when I'm looking at me that it's me looking back at me. It's the me that lives inside of me. It's the me that you have clothed me with flesh and skin as a garment. And so when I see videos like this, it just further strengthens and enlightens the things that we've been talking about in the Torah world, in the biblical mindset, for thousands of years at this point. Love to hear your comments below, and if you like this content overall, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Take care.